So come back to the next speaker. We still have time, don't worry. We had Matthew Andrew, and he's an expert in taxations. So he head the Ernst & Young Asia Pacific Tax Efficiency Supply Chain Management Practice from Singapore. He has over 15 years in this area, and as well as transfer pricing experience. He has extensive experience in tax business structuring planning into Asia from European and United States MNCs. He has assisted many MNCs set up business structure in Singapore, Thailand, PRC, Malaysia, India, Indonesia, almost every part in Asia. As part of his business restructurings, he has assisted companies to negotiate access to FTAs, as well as negotiate bilateral advanced pricing agreements with the Australian, New Zealand, United States, Japan, and Singapore taxation authorities. Furthermore, he has extensive experience working with NNC to negotiate tax incentives with the Singapore Economic Development Board, Ministry of Finance for Thailand, Malaysia, and the China Taxation Authority. So without further delay, I would like to invite Mr. Matthew to give his presentation.
Thank you. I've got this. Doesn't want to work. Sure. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. We'll just continue on in the meantime. I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep this very short and focused. And what I'm really going to be talking about today around the electronics industry is really around the supplier base and around the manufacturing base. And I think what's important there is what I'm going to talk about is the electronics industry has traditionally been clustered in 4 countries: Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China, increasingly China. And interestingly, what I want to talk a little bit about is a little bit different perhaps to the car makers, for example, and the parts makers. Obviously, these are products, the fabricated wafer, the circuit boards, etc., are industries and products which are very small and portable. And increasingly, what we're seeing is companies moving away from those high-cost, high-tax locations and into low-cost, low-tax locations. And I think that's important as we move on, because what's critical here is, I think from your perspective, is what does it mean moving forward for Greater Asia outside those 4 locations. So perhaps I will very quickly talk about the structure of the industry. I'll talk about the factors impacting a country's success. Where is the semiconductor and the electronics industry located? Where will it be located? And some of the policy initiatives we've seen governments take to attract more of the, sorry, I'm a little bit too apologise, moving the industry into other locations in Asia. First of all, we start with the suppliers. So here we're kind of talking about the Dow Chemicals, right, who have the chemicals that are needed to make OLED, you know, for the plasma televisions, for example. We're talking about the Cornings, which have the glass, and in the future we'll see mobile phones that you can actually fold up. And so a lot of those, a lot of the suppliers are actually based, obviously, some are US multinationals, some are Asian countries, the silicon providers. And then we start moving into the component manufacturing So here we're talking about companies which actually take the circuit board, put circuits in, put the wafer in, and put the elements into the circuit board. So here we're talking about the Jables, the Foxcons, the Flextronics, for example, who work and outsource as contract manufacturers. And then obviously, this is an integrated industry moving up, actually pulling the actual hardware with the boards together into true contract manufacturing. So again, we're talking similar players here in terms of the Foxcons, and I think this is kind of interesting. I have a number of clients in China, for example, who literally, before you actually get a finished Lenovo product, it would have been through, for example, maybe 3 times, at 3 different times, Jabil, twice through Foxconn, 3 times through Flextronics to get the finished product. And so this industry is extremely integrated in terms of where the suppliers are located and where the contract manufacturing and the component suppliers are located as well. And then we have the OEMs, for example. So now we're starting to talk about the Samsungs, we're talking about the LGs, the Toshibas, for example, etc. And again, I think it's interesting, some of the companies I've just mentioned in terms of the Jables, etc., and the Flextronics, who have traditionally been pure contract manufacturers on behalf of the OEMs, they're now starting to move up into wanting to do OEM, to become an OEM on branded product themselves. And we're seeing that particularly in the area of medical device. And then lastly, we have the retail and the co-packers and the configurers. And again, it can be integrated through here. It can even be the component providers themselves. And then lastly, the retail and the online, the web direct sale of product. So broadly, we're going to focus on today on the supply base and the OEMs. Where's it located? Why is it located where it is right now? So this is an example that I put together. And again, if we talk across the locations, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, China, Malaysia, Vietnam. And we see that some of the players I've talked about being in traditional locations like Taiwan, which is a massive player in the semiconductor industry, Japan and China, for example, which is fully integrated across in the supply chain from supplier to actual retail itself. I think it's important, Taiwan has traditionally been a real home for semiconductor and contract manufacturing. There's a huge amount of talent, and a lot of that talent has now been exported into places like Singapore, exported into places like China, exported into places like Malaysia, for example, particularly in Penang, where we do get contract manufacturing and component manufacturing for the big OEMs. We can also see here clustering does occur. So where the big OEMs are located, you'll get the suppliers and you'll get the component and contract manufacturers. And that's particularly the case in China. We are seeing, for example, more and more of the OEMs move their value chain or their supply chain out of places like Japan and Korea, for example, into places like China, Vietnam, Malaysia, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. These are the types of players we see, and again, the purpose of the slide is to show that there is some integration across the value chain, but there are also different players, and they tend to be, what's important in the electronics industry, 57% of the entire industry is based in Asia. And we'll show some stats, and a lot of that is based in those, right now, in those 4 locations. And so again, we look at the fabs and the fabless, so making the wafers, components, and contract manufacturers, pulling it all together, and then moving it on and finishing and assembling. And again, you'll see Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China feature very heavily, as does a little bit of Singapore as well, but very specific types of electronic products. So this is when it starts to get a little bit more interesting for you, and the reason is the supply base. So the semiconductor, contract manufacturing, and component industry. 38% of that industry currently sits in China. And that's in places like Wuxi, in Nansha, increasingly Chengdu in the centre, and also traditionally in places like Suzhou as well. So there's a huge amount of talent and quite a long history and talent base associated with those particular locations. So we see clustering in those cities between the suppliers, the component makers, and the contract manufacturers and OEMs. And there's a particular reason why China is critical here, which I'll talk about in a little bit. What's kind of interesting from these statistics as well is that Japan, you'll see from 2012 to 2013 has dropped by 8 points in terms of the percentage of the electronics industry located in Japan. South Korea has slightly dropped. And what's interesting is Taiwan is also a critical player, as I've mentioned, is the other rest of Asia has increased from 26% to 36%. And that's kind of interesting. Would anyone care to hazard a guess why that would be? That's a 10% shift in 1 year, which is it's pretty significant for the industry. Okay, I'll keep going. China's critical and China's hard to get out of. And the reason is, have you heard of bonded logistics parks? Bonded logistics parks, have you heard of the old Hong Kong U-turn? Okay, so those are probably tax and customs type terms, but they're really important because a lot of multinationals in Asia, non-China companies based in China, like to get money into China and out of China. And because it's such a fully integrated industry, what happens is you end up making it, you work with a supplier in China, components in China, pull it together and contract manufacture in China, and you sell it in China. The money never leaves China. And that's a problem for a lot of US multinationals and European multinationals, etc., because they want money out of China. But because of the foreign exchange control rules, you cannot get money out of China unless you have an export certificate. And in order to have an export certificate, you need to take the product out of China. And so in the bad old days, what used to happen is the trucks used to line up in Shenzhen and go across the border, get the export certificate, and come back in because they wanted the money out. What happens now is there's 37 bonded logistics parks which the government has set up, which are virtual export zones. So you drive the truck into the bonded logistics park, it's there for a little bit, and you drive it out, and you get your money out. And so a lot of this industry, Toshiba, Samsung, Foxconn, Flextronics, are all based in these bonded logistics parks, and they're fully integrated. And they've got warehouses and factories beside each other. And so it's difficult to disaggregate that supply chain. But what we're seeing in China is those bonded logistics parks are now moving out of the coast and into the centre. So places like Chengdu, we're seeing a huge shift of the contract manufacturing and configuration industry moving into Chengdu because it's significantly cheaper in terms of labour force, because the coast is now much more expensive. And that's also the reason why we're seeing a shift into Southeast Asia in terms of configuration and contract manufacturing and even supplier base, because of labour costs and lease costs. And also in places like China and Taiwan, the tax incentives are all coming off. So a lot of these companies I've mentioned have all been in China a very long time. All those tax incentives are all gone, or all going. What's interesting again, if you look at this, you'll see Samsung and LG Korea is a massive player on the OEM space. So these two companies, along with the major Japanese companies, are major players in the region, and you'll see a clustering of contract manufacturing, configuration and suppliers around these 5 or 6 companies. That's really important because that clustering is really important in terms of shifting the industry out of places like Korea and Japan and into places like China and Southeast Asia and other places. So what are the major trends we're seeing? Obviously on the supply base, decreased product life cycles. How many people here have a an iPhone 5 or a Galaxy Samsung. I mean, my frustration with that is every 18 months I'm updating, and I can't even get the apps that I want anymore. So I think that product life cycle is definitely moving. We are seeing the supplier base wanting to minimize design complexity, obviously, and we're also we're seeing high cost manufacturing move to low cost countries. I would say now, in my view, China can be considered medium to high cost in this industry. But we are seeing North Asia diversification into Southeast Asia right now, and that's happening, and that's good for places like for example, Malaysia and Vietnam. We're seeing OEMs margins erode, and I would say in a very, very significant way. So I work with some of the, I guess they're sort of laptop producers, OEMs, and in some cases, the channel profit from end to end can be as low as 2% operating profit. And that's a massive problem in terms of if you're in a high cost location and you're paying a lot of tax and you're paying customs duty. That's a real problem for these guys to make money. We're seeing also labor-intensive production shift to China and ASEAN. And for example, Samsung is continuing to move production out of Korea and into places like China and other places. Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore and Hong Kong are looking to move up the value chain. So they're looking to move into research and development. They want to own IP. There's a lot of joint ventures going on with the OEMs in order to sort of work on new products together and create new value. So there's a lot of research development centres, engineering centres of excellence going into those locations. And I would sort of say a lot of that skill set is actually coming out of Taiwan as well. So what factors are impacting a country's success? I'm now sort of just going to start to finish up my presentation, and I wanted to sort of put in 3 or 4 bullet points what I see with my clients and what I see in the industry in terms of what factors are making the industry move from a very centralized North Asian business into a much more diversified spread business throughout Southeast Asia as well as North Asia. I think establishing a critical mass of consumer electronics companies, I think, is actually fundamental, very much like the automotive industry. I showed you the statistics here. These companies, which have traditionally been based in those locations, clearly are attracting attracting component providers. Suppliers are locating their headquarters there. Contract manufacturers are locating in those locations. We're also critically providing low-cost manufacturing for electronics. And that probably has 2 parts for me. Low cost is critical in terms of the eroding operating profit, channel profit we're seeing. Low cost is critical, but there has to be a base of talent. And I think that's really important. So in my view, places like, for example, Penang are well set up to potentially to be a real beneficiary of this shift to a more low-cost location, because it already has a talent group which has been there for quite some time on the component side, on the contract manufacturing side, and even shared service side as well, outsourcing. I think both contract suppliers and contract manufacturers have moved to China, and originally they moved to China because it was low cost. There was a cluster of research and development and manufacturing incentives, free trade agreements, and other incentives. And let me just start with the research and development. I think what's really important is Taiwan and Korea, for example, and China have had a lot of IP, intangible property, or intellectual property incentives. So if you do research and development in those locations through joint ventures, which a lot of the OEMs are doing with their suppliers, and they're also doing with their contract manufacturers, is you can get very good tax exemption for that cost. And in some cases, it can be up to 400% of every dollar spent, you can get $4 back. Same with manufacturing as well, high value manufacturing. So the incentives have been important for originally putting more manufacturing and more of the industry into places like Korea and Taiwan. Free trade agreements are also very critical as well, as I've mentioned. And I thought the point was well made. A lot of times we sort of see in industry, supplier base and manufacturing base will be next to where the market is. And that makes a lot of sense. And for this industry in particular, the good news is for developing countries is a lot of the free trade agreements in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world are available in this particular industry. The ASEAN free trade agreements with China, for example, with Japan, with Korea, for example, means that most of the actual components are going in at zero or very low customs rate. And so that's why there's flexibility, and we are seeing this now disbursement of the manufacturing and component manufacturing out of those locations, because you can get it back in for very low customs cost. Clearly there's a trade-off in terms of logistics and time, but in a lot of cases that value is being recouped. And I've already mentioned free trade zones, bonded logistics parks in places like Korea and Taiwan and China, for example. Those are free zones where you can land product and move product on without potentially a customs value associated with that. So all these countries, if I think of this, have put in place policies to attract from a customs perspective, from a tax perspective, and also from a research and development perspective. So summing up now, what I really wanted to sort of focus on is say, is there an opportunity for this to disperse even wider? I think there is, but I think the prerequisites to that have to be policy shift in terms of tax rate incentives, free trade agreement expansion, and I also think focus on research and development. And underscoring all of that, there is going to need to be a clustering element, bringing that cluster together, and that might be through some incentive program, which will attract the suppliers, because the suppliers will move and the contract manufacturers will move with the OEMs. But that the right talent has to be there, and the development of that talent, and then obviously all the other factors I've mentioned behind that in terms of the fiscal policy, I think means that we are seeing places like Malaysia, like Vietnam, and even other locations now really taking advantage. And that 10% swing I talked about from being 26% other outside Japan, Korea, and China is now 36%, because those locations have actually taken the opportunity to put the right free zones in, customs, free trade agreements, tax incentives, and are putting policies in place in terms of trying to develop talent. So I think those are good examples of potentially where this industry could even be more geographically spread as well. Albert, I think I'll leave it there. I know we're short of time. Yep. Okay. Any questions from that? Okay.